had forced work and no health, no education, no rights, no nothing. That it was not very difficult to mobilize people to fight against Portuguese army. So we did it.
And so in the 1960s, Manuel dos Santos left his engineering studies in Lisbon and, like others, joined the liberation movement for Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, called the PAIGC. The movement had been set up in 1956 by a man who had become a legend of the fight against Portuguese rule in Africa. His name was Amilcar Cabral.
Amilcar Cabral.
We are fighting in our country, Guinea, in Cape Verde Island, for liberate our people, for freedom, and for our right to build progress for our people. And we are not communists. We are African nationalists fighting for the independence.
Cabral was a young, charismatic and rather unique leader, for he was an agricultural engineer, philosopher, writer and poet, turned freedom fighter.
He was a very clever man. He was an intellectual, a great intellectual. Even today, when reading Cabral, I always find new things. But he was a very simple man also, capable of telling anecdotes, speaking to people, having a whiskey, a drink with his people. And he was the main director of the armed struggle. He gave the instructions to his commanders, and we put it in practice. And he was able to call each soldier by his name, not the commanders, the soldiers. And he could explain very complicated concepts in a very simple language. That is Cabral.
Each man has the right to be respected, to preserve his dignity, not only against the colonialists, no, facing any other man without consideration of the color of the skin.
But Amilcar Cabral was not just a local liberation leader. He helped create a united front for liberation forces fighting across Portugal's African colonies, including Angola and Mozambique. And their collective efforts drained Portugal of men and resources. In Guinea-Bissau alone, 40,000 Portuguese troops were deployed. To fight them, the rebels waged a guerrilla war from bases in the country's forests and jungles.
Of course, life in the field was not easy. We were in danger every day. But I survived for many years in the jungle.
Supported and armed by neighboring African nations and Soviet states, the liberation forces soon controlled much of the country, as Amilcar Cabral often told the BBC.
How much territory in Portuguese Guinea do you now control?
We control more than 2/3 of the territory, but the town is still occupied by the Portuguese troops.
What sort of opposition are you meeting from the Portuguese?
The main activities of the Portuguese are bombing with jet planes and also combined operations with helicopters and paratroops in order to make terrorism against the population of the liberated zones.
Even the Portuguese repression in Guinea-Bissau was fundamentally favorable to us because they were showing the population how they were. And we were completely different. Our 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers were all voluntary, no conscription, and 40% of the organization were women. When we reached the village, population used to feed us, and we didn't have to ask for that.
And in these liberated areas, Cabral and the movement, the PAIGC, set out to create a kind of state in waiting and set up the schools and healthcare that Portuguese colonialism had failed to provide.
My country has been dominated by Portugal for all this time of colonialism. Never developed. We had only 2 hospitals in all the country, only 45 schools for children.
As you know, Cabral used to say that no one fights for abstract ideas. People fight to improve their lives. We had health services, courts, we had all over the country schools, because in that time in Guinea-Bissau we had a very huge illiteracy. And that's something that we had to begin changing even during the war.
We are fighting not only Portuguese colonialists, but also to create a new life in our liberated zones. If you had visited my country some years ago and now you will see very great progress really.
But then, on the eve of victory, in January 1973, Amilcar Cabral was assassinated, gunned down in neighbouring Guinea-Conakry by some disaffected comrades, part of a plot many believe was orchestrated by Portuguese intelligence.
Amilcar Cabral.
Commander dos Santos was in the Soviet Union at the time, training with 150 other Guinean fighters. He had to call them all together to tell them the devastating news.
I assisted one of the most terrible scenes ever. I saw people, hard soldiers that faced death every day in the field. They were crying because Cabral was dead. They wept. It's not common to see that for the death of a man.
But Cabral's death did not change the course of the war.
In 1973, we had good anti-aircraft weapons, and we finished with Portuguese aviation in Guinea-Bissau. And after that, our troops was in the offensive up to the end. And we proclaimed independence in 1973, even during the war.
In Guinea, the African revolutionaries have announced the formation of their own state, and their government has been granted observer status at the United Nations.
In the following year, in 1974, the collective toll of the wars of liberation in Africa helped trigger a coup back in Portugal, which ended the dictatorship there and also led to independence being officially conceded to Portugal's African colonies.
We were all very glad that it had finished, because we were tired of the war. Portuguese were more tired than us, but we were tired also. We wanted freedom. We wanted to live normal lives, as any young man.
And though the war was finally over, the legend of Amilcar Cabral lived on.
You know, Cabral was unique. And I knew what was his value, what he meant to us. He was a very good man, the greatest one I ever met.
I would like you to believe that we are not warriors. We are not making war in our country because we like war. We don't like war. We like peace. But peace doesn't mean nothing without freedom.
The late Amilcar Cabral and Commander Manuel dos Santos, ending this edition of Witness History with me, Alex Last. For more of our history programmes, just search online for BBC Witness History.
This is the BBC World Service, and on this week's assignment...
I'm Lina Sinjab, introducing a collection of programs from Syria made during the past decade after a peaceful revolution turned into a civil war. This week, a football team who found themselves on opposing sides of the conflict.
Journeys to the heart of a story. Assignment, Thursday at 8 and 19 GMT. And in 30 minutes, Sport Today with Mike Williams.
We're just a few hours away from finding out if Manchester United or Villarreal will win the 2021 Europa League final. And we ask if the soaring summer temperatures in Tokyo will prove just as big a challenge to Olympic organisers as coronavirus.
Stay with us. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 18 hours GMT, this is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Gareth Barlow. Coming up.
When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily, how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
The government failed, so says the British Prime Minister's former chief advisor, while being questioned about the coronavirus pandemic. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, a court rules the oil giant Royal Dutch Shell must drastically cut CO2 emissions. Also to come on the programme, India counts the cost of a devastating cyclone in West Bengal, which has destroyed thousands of homes. And it's all change at MI6 as James Bond gets a new boss. Plus, it's noisy in Gdansk. We're live in the Polish city ahead of the Europa League final. This is the BBC.
BBC News, I'm John Shea. Climate activists have won a landmark ruling in a Dutch court against the oil giant Shell. The court ruled that the firm must cut greenhouse gas emissions substantially by the end of the decade. Shell described the outcome as disappointing. Anna Holligan reports from The Hague.
The groundbreaking case was launched in 2019 by the Dutch branch of Friends of the Earth. They accused Shell of violating human rights by continuing to invest billions in fossil fuels and said the company's transition to clean energy should go further and faster. The judge agreed and ordered Shell to reduce its emissions 45% by 2030 compared with 2019 levels. This is the first time that judges have compelled a company to emit less carbon dioxide by changing its policy, and the legal precedent could inspire other activists seeking to protect the planet via the courts.
The UN says it's deeply alarmed by reports from Ethiopia's Tigray region that at least 200 people displaced by fighting have been rounded up by soldiers and detained. Eyewitnesses said troops entered makeshift displacement camps at 2 schools on Monday night and took people away in trucks. Ethiopia's military has dismissed the allegations as fabricated. Dozens of people in northwest Nigeria are missing after a boat broke in two and sank. Most of the passengers were women and children travelling from Niger State to neighbouring Kebbi. Witnesses say more than 160 people were on the vessel. 22 have been rescued. The local authorities told the BBC that divers and emergency workers were trying to save others. The former chief advisor to the British Prime Minister says tens of thousands of people died needlessly from coronavirus because of disastrous failings by the government. Dominic Cummings told MPs that Boris Johnson had initially dismissed COVID-19 as a scare story. The Prime Minister has rejected the accusations. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, reports.
The hours of testimony gave a disturbing sense of an administration simply overwhelmed by the scale of the COVID crisis at the start of last year, scrambling and failing to keep up on many fronts. It is the first time that one of those involved in making the decisions during those risky months has admitted that so many mistakes were made. It is the first time that some of Boris Johnson's most controversial alleged views about COVID have been put on the record. And it is the first time that someone who wielded significant power has said publicly that tens of thousands of people lost their lives in this country unnecessarily.
A gunman has opened fire at a rail yard in the US state of California. Local officials say 8 people have been killed and that the gunman is also dead. It's not clear how the gunman died or whether police officers fired their weapons at the scene. World News from the BBC. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has dismissed corruption allegations made by a mafia boss against prominent government officials and allies. Beza Şimşek from our Turkish service has more details.
In an address to his party's MPs, Mr. Erdogan said he was leading the fight against organized crime gangs and would bring them to justice. He also defended the Interior Minister, Süleyman Soylu, who has been the main target of Sedat Peker. The minister has filed a criminal complaint demanding the mafia boss be charged with slander. Sedat Peker has been posting videos online since early May, following a police operation against him. The videos, watched by tens of millions of people, have shaken Turkish politics with allegations of official involvement in crimes, including murder, rape, extortion, and drug trafficking going back decades.
The Iraqi military say they've arrested a senior militia commander under the country's anti-terrorism laws. Qasim Musli is a provincial chief of the Popular Mobilization Forces, a grouping of mostly Shia militias backed by Iran. He's said to have been detained in connection with several attacks. Amazon says it's agreed to buy the Hollywood studio MGM for nearly $8.5 billion. The deal would give Amazon's video streaming services access to thousands of films. Samira Hussain reports.
007, meet Jeff Bezos. Normally a conservative spender, the Amazon chief executive is paying an eye-watering sum to acquire one of Hollywood's best-known studios. Buying MGM will dramatically increase the amount of content on Amazon's streaming service, Prime Video, as it continues to compete for subscribers with the established juggernaut Netflix and newer entrants into the streaming sector like Disney Plus and Apple.
And that's the latest BBC World News.
You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Gareth Barlow. When a sacked chief advisor to the British Prime Minister accuses the government of having caused the unnecessary deaths of thousands of people, it's much more than a disgruntled former employee criticising his old boss. But that's exactly what happened today in front of a parliamentary committee in London. Dominic Cummings, who was Boris Johnson's chief advisor until last November, said that ministers and officials had fallen disastrously short of what the British people could expect in the coronavirus pandemic.
The truth is that senior ministers, senior officials, senior advisors like me fell disastrously short of the standards that the public has a right to expect of its government in a crisis like this. When the public needed us most, the government failed. And I'd like to say to all the families of those who died unnecessarily how sorry I am for the mistakes that were made and for my own mistakes at that.
Mr Cummings said the Prime Minister had delayed the first lockdown, which was imposed in March last year, as he reportedly initially didn't think the spread of infections could be stopped and was instead resigned to the concept of herd immunity. I asked our political correspondent Rob Watson, whom in particular Mr Cummings had in his sight.
He had two targets, really. The first was what you might call the sort of machinery of government, and it was pretty astonishing that in a state as sophisticated and rich as the UK, he was essentially saying all those officials, the health department, scientists, everybody had let the side down, that they hadn't understood exactly what the country was facing. The second target was Boris Johnson and other senior government ministers, and his point there being that, look, at the start of the crisis in March, you couldn't necessarily blame Mr Johnson for not locking down right away because he was getting bad advice. But Mr Cummings' point was that by September, by the time Mr Johnson denied a second lockdown, then it was Mr Johnson to blame because all the scientists were saying, look what happened in March. There can't be any reason why you wouldn't do this. And that is why Mr Cummings then added that Mr Johnson, and pretty much Mr Johnson alone, was responsible for the needless death, as he put it, of tens of thousands of people.
It's incredibly strong language, and 127,000 people have been known to have died with COVID-19 in the UK. Those lives can't be brought back. What difference will his testimony, his very strong comments make?
It's very hard to answer, Gareth. I mean, the evidence suggests that you might say not much. And why would I say that after this astonishing indictment of Mr Johnson and his government? Well, because this is a country that's profoundly polarised. So half the country thinks, good old Boris most of the time and we'll forgive him for anything. The other half have sort of made up their minds that they think that he's a hopeless buffoon. So it's sort of everything seen through that prism. The second reason why you might think that this won't have an impact is because the way human beings kind of are wired, we tend to remember how something ends rather than how it starts. So people are focused on the success of the vaccine programme rather than all these mistakes. But I think there is a danger here for the government. I mean, the fact that someone right inside, on the very inside of how the government dealt with this crisis, Mr Johnson's closest advisor, the fact that he has said tens of thousands of people died needlessly is a hard thing to walk away from. And one other final thought about what Mr Cummings had to say. He said that Mr Johnson he decided by October that Mr Johnson was fundamentally unfit for high office. Well, if Mr Cummings is right, perhaps it'll become apparent to other people, not just his closest advisors, but to the voters, that maybe Mr Johnson isn't all that he might be.
The BBC's Rob Watson. The oil giant Royal Dutch Shell has been instructed by a Dutch court to drastically speed up cuts to its greenhouse gas emissions. The ruling in a landmark case brought by the environmental group Friends of the Earth, local climate activists, and more than 17,000 Dutch citizens could set an important precedent for firms like Shell. Initially, at least, the ruling is only binding in the Netherlands, but as we heard from our energy and environment analyst Roger Harrabin, it will have immediate international consequences.
It could prove to be extremely significant. I mean, let's take it for a start off. Let's suppose that Shell appeal, which they say they will, and get it overturned. Will it be significant then? Yes, I think it will, because even if it's overturned, it sends a message to companies around the world that they are now likely to be hounded in the courts. Now, previously, there have been some actions by citizens and by environmentalists against governments, making governments match up to their promises. But I can't think of any incidents like this one where a company has had its feet held to the fire in this way. So let's supposing even if Shell appeal and win, I think it will be significant. If Shell appeal and lose, then it's really remarkable, because it means the courts can step in and order specific actions from specific companies. Now, when the international rules on climate change are brought up, and we talk about a cut of 45% in emissions by 2030, it's up to countries to decide how their own individual actors should respond to that. So every country is supposed to do at least 45% cut. In the UK, of course, it's much higher. But then those countries will decide which companies or which sectors should respond in which ways. Now, suddenly, the courts want to have a direct line to the company, and that completely changes the rules if Shell lose on this appeal.
And Roger, just to be clear, this ruling only applies, does it, to the Netherlands?
Yes, absolutely, that's right. But, it's still really significant, because wherever companies are now, they will be looking over their shoulder thinking, OK, who's coming for us next and how are we going to respond? And already there is huge pressure on major corporations to change. I mean, in this case, Shell is an oil and gas company. And basically, it's going to have to transform itself pretty damn quick into a renewables and hydrogen and offshore wind company. And that is a massive, massive task. And previously, I mean, it has been argued, of course, that Shell and others just simply haven't done enough. They haven't taken it seriously enough. But I suspect they will now.
Roger Harrabin speaking to Matthew Rolliwaller. It's official.
Come on, Bond. Where the hell are you?
If we don't do this, there will be nothing left to save.
The trailer to the latest James Bond film, No Time to Die, is now part of Amazon. The media and retail giant has bought the film studio, MGM, and its huge back catalogue for nearly $8.5 billion. For Bond fans, that means the Amazon boss, Jeff Bezos, is the new M. Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd joins us. And Vincent, this is a blockbuster deal for a blockbuster film studio. What does this mean, though? Will Bond still have a licence to kill?
This is one of the most interesting elements of this mega deal. MGM does have a major interest in No Time to Die, which is finally due for release at the end of September. Daniel Craig's final outing as 007, of course. It's a jewel in the crown, clearly, for Jeff Bezos, because he's now the king of Bond. Isn't he? Well, no, actually, he's not. Within hours of it becoming clear that Amazon are to buy MGM, subject to regulators' approval, the people who actually make the Bond films have been making hands-off noises. Eon Productions, based here in London, run by Barbara Broccoli and her half-brother Michael G. Wilson, the family, of course, of Cubby Broccoli, have told Variety that No Time to Die, and I'm sure the Bonds which follow, will be worldwide theatrical releases. They're going into cinemas. They're not going to be streamed, not at first anyway. Eon are reminding everyone who it is calls the shots, because they do.
And it's only partly about new films, isn't it? Because Amazon are interested in the library, the back catalogue too.
It's about content. Amazon know that though it does have good titles, in the public mind Amazon Prime is a runner-up to Netflix and Disney+. This deal brings them access to around 17,000 hours of TV, around 4,000 film titles, but movie rights are complex. MGM does not by any means control every film it's ever made. Some people in the industry think Jeff Bezos has overpaid for a library which has classics in it, but a fair amount of mediocre stuff too. Bezos says he wants to reimagine what a Hollywood studio does. Well, we've got a lot to see how it all pans out in the next couple of years.
We'll watch closely. We'll watch the films even more closely. Vincent Dowd for now. Thank you. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Still to come here on the newsroom, some welcome news for an endangered tiger species. But first, John has the headlines.
The former chief advisor to the British Prime Minister has said the government's disastrous response to the coronavirus pandemic cost many lives. In a landmark case brought by climate activists, a Dutch court has ordered the oil giant Shell to make big reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And dozens of villages have been inundated along India's Bengal coast after the region was hit by a severe cyclone.
Yes, thousands of homes in addition in West Bengal have been destroyed. At least 2 people are known to have been killed, one dragged out to sea by 4-metre high waves. Winds of up to 140 kilometres an hour have now weakened, but rising water levels triggered by torrential rainfall have breached river embankments, swamping low-lying areas. Tidal surges, meanwhile, have also flooded coastal villages in Bangladesh. Our reporter in Delhi, Padma Manashki, told us about the relief effort.
The authorities were ready, expecting the damage that this cyclone might cause. Civil and military authorities have made widespread arrangements to tackle the impact. For example, Indian Air Force has conducted operations since May 21st to prepare for this cyclone. And as per the official reports, it has airlifted tons of humanitarian assistance and they have placed them in the cyclone affected areas.
So a huge response from the government. What is the situation on the ground at the moment?
The authorities are in the process of restoring the road and power connectivity. They are saying it might take another 24 hours to restore some parts, and most of the people have been evacuated from the affected areas.
Obviously, this is all ongoing amid the coronavirus pandemic. To what degree did the COVID-19 situation complicate this?
Of course, COVID-19 situation has complicated the relief arrangements, and because with the rise in cases, only on yesterday 10,000 cases were recorded in the state of Odisha. It has become a challenge for the authorities. COVID care centers are being used as evacuation relief camps. It was difficult to maintain COVID protocols.
Just a few days ago, really, Mumbai narrowly avoided a cyclone itself. Now we're talking about this one inundating dozens of villages and destroying thousands of homes in West Bengal. How
last 48 hours. It's been absolutely terrific. Just such a shame that this stadium right next to me here will not be full, only operating at 25% capacity. Yes, under 10,000 in there, but officially the allocation for Manchester United and Villarreal is just 2,000 each. So the supporters who have come here do feel very, very fortunate indeed. Villarreal, the massive underdogs, Manchester United in their first final for 4 years. It does feel like a special occasion because there are so few fans here and they feel blessed.
Not many fans there, but we can hear the bubble of the atmosphere, the excitement, the odd horn in the background. How easy has it been for the supporters to get into the stadium, to get those coveted tickets?
Getting into the stadium, not an issue at all. Getting into the country in these COVID times, that's what everybody has been really bonding over. Trickier for the fans from Manchester United because of UK putting Poland on their amber travel list, so they have to take PCR tests to get into the country, some of them PCR tests to get out, and then go into up to 10 days quarantine when they get home. A little bit easier for the Spaniards who are within the Schengen area, but again they've had to jump through some COVID hoops as well. But with football and life we keep our fingers crossed for slowly opening up, they've just jumped at this opportunity to go and watch their team in a major European final.
Like you say, football's starting to open up. I assume the authorities will be keeping a really close eye on how this match goes with the Euros coming up so close behind.
Well, absolutely. They're very well versed in how to look after fans around a stadium. I mean, just 4,000 officially from both sets going in. As I say, that's not an issue. But with different priorities when it comes to COVID protocols between different borders, Germany very strict at the moment, because it is across so many cities, the Euros, in just over a fortnight's time it starts. They will be seeing how the flow of fans from the UK, from Spain with these Villarreal fans, just how well it has worked and how safely it's gone as well.
Ollie Foster in Gdansk for the moment. Thank you very much. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has hit back at international criticism of his diversion of a Ryanair flight to Minsk, where an opposition journalist on board was arrested along with his girlfriend. He accused critics trying to strangle his country and insisted that the journalist, Roman Protasevich, was a terrorist. Our correspondent, Sarah Rainsford, has been speaking to the mother of the detained woman, Sofia Sapiega.
Ala Dudic says her life changed forever on Sunday. That's when her daughter, Sofia Sapiega, was flying across the EU from a holiday in Greece, and her plane was forcibly diverted to Minsk. Sofia's boyfriend is the Belarusian opposition activist Roman Protasevich. Both were arrested on landing. Anna just got one text message that said "Mum" before Sofia's phone was out of reach. Since then, all she's seen is a video confession recorded by her daughter's interrogators. She tells me it was a traumatic watch, a deep shock. She doesn't understand why Sofia was arrested. She's not an activist, she tells me, just a normal student who was in love. I really hope she'll be freed, Anna says, that they won't destroy my child's life. But today, the Belarusian president described Sofia as an agent of the West and her boyfriend Roman as a terrorist. Speaking in Parliament, he painted the forced landing of the Ryanair flight as a genuine bomb scare and himself as a hero for saving lives. And Alexander Lukashenko lashed out at Western countries who've imposed fresh sanctions over the incident and pledged more to come.
Our ill wishers both outside and inside Belarus have changed their methods of attack. They've crossed many red lines and crossed the boundaries of common sense and human decency. They've moved from plotting riots to strangling us.
It was a defiant response by a man whose long rule of Belarus once looked threatened by mass protests, but who is now very much back in charge here.
Sarah Rainsford reporting from Minsk. Now let's take a look at some of the other stories we're following today with John.
West African mediators who are in Mali following this week's coup have met the deposed President Ban Dor and the Prime Minister Mokhtar Wan. They've been held at an army camp since Monday. On Tuesday, Colonel Assimi Goïta, who also led a coup last year, announced that he'd ousted them because they'd named a new cabinet without consulting the military. The former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan is in Mali trying to mediate on behalf of the West African bloc ECOWAS. He told reporters that Colonel Goïta had promised to clarify how Mr Ndor and Mr Wan might be released.
The Vice President told us that they are working out the mechanism of releasing. In terms of what the structure of government will look like, we have not concluded. We are still consulting.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he's working with Egypt to build on the ceasefire that halted the fighting between Israel and Palestinian militants. Mr Blinken, who's on a tour of the Middle East, was speaking in Cairo after talks with the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. It was Egypt that brokered the ceasefire, and Mr Sisi said the recent events had reaffirmed the need for direct talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians with US involvement. And the Royal Navy in Britain has appointed its first female admiral since it was founded nearly 500 years ago. Jude Terry said she was honoured to be the first and predicted she wouldn't be the last. She'll take up the job next year when she'll also become the Navy's Director for Personnel overseeing recruitment. Women were first allowed to serve at sea on Royal Navy warships little more than 30 years ago.
John, thank you. And finally, we finish this edition of the Newsroom with some good news for an endangered species of tiger. 3 Amur cubs have been born at a wildlife park in the Scottish Highlands. Harry Bly has the story.
8 days after they were born, the cubs are yet to open their eyes. Their mother, Dominica, is caring for them in a private section of their enclosure, away from public view. Keeping a close eye, but from a distance, are the zookeepers at Scotland's Highland Wildlife Park. Vicky Larkin is the head keeper of carnivores at the park.
I think captivity is really important. There aren't plans to reintroduce them into the wild currently, but should that happen in the future, we have a good stable population in captivity.
She explained why the birth was such an important moment for the species.
Well, in the wild, there's thought to be around 500 Amur tigers, so the numbers are pretty low. Although seemingly stable, but still pretty low.
The cubs are currently the size of a butternut squash, but will probably quadruple in size in the first 4 months. They're native to the far east of Russia, with some across the border in China. And as Vicky Larkin explains, this makes them a distinctive-looking big cat.
Temperatures in the far east of Russia and parts of China can be like minus 40 degrees in the winter. So it's quite cold, extreme temperatures. Their coats are much thicker and shaggier.
And the tigers are adjusting well to the Highlands of Scotland, with climates not dissimilar to their native home.
Yeah, it's really good, a good climate for them here. Probably a bit wetter here than it will be in their natural habitat. Whereas in their natural habitat, the summers are quite mild and a little bit wet, but the winters are generally quite cold and dry.
Vicky Larkin from Scotland's Highland Wildlife Park, ending that report by Harry Bly. And I was just near the wildlife park all of yesterday, and I can report it is pretty cold up there at the moment. Now, while Dominica is being kept away from public view, you can see her butternut squash-sized cubs on our website. It's bbc.com/news. I'm taking a look now, and they really are very cute indeed. That's it for this edition of The Newsroom. There's plenty more on the website and, of course, on the Global News podcast. You can download it online. Thanks for all for now.
Coming up next, it's Sport Today. And then in 30 minutes, it's Finders Keepers.
What are we collecting now for future generations? Whose history are we collecting? How are we in fact collecting things about the Black Lives Matter movement today for future generations to know about?
And then it's our weekly health check. Here's Claudia Hammond.
We'll be asking whether kindness can be contagious and looking
by the fighting have been rounded up by soldiers and detained. Ethiopia's military has dismissed the allegations as fabricated. More than 100 people in northwest Nigeria are missing, feared drowned, after an overloaded boat sank. Most were women and children. Only 22 have been rescued. The former chief advisor to Britain's Prime Minister has said tens of thousands of lives were lost during the pandemic because of the government's disastrous failings. Dominic Cummings told MPs Boris Johnson initially dismissed COVID-19 as a scare story. Mr. Johnson rejected the accusations. Police in the US state of California say at least 8 people have been killed in a shooting at a rail yard in San Jose. Others have been injured. The gunman, who is also dead, worked at the rail facility. Qatar has said it'll give $500 million to help rebuild Gaza, following the fighting between Israel and Palestinian militants. Israeli airstrikes inflicted many casualties and much damage on the territory. A powerful cyclone on India's east coast has killed at least 4 people and left many homeless. Storm surges inundated villages in the low-lying areas of Odisha and West Bengal. And the Royal Navy in Britain has appointed its first female admiral since it was founded nearly 500 years ago. Jude Terry said she was honoured to be the first and predicted she wouldn't be the last. BBC News.
Over the wall, and it's into the net! And that's been driven beautifully. Serena Williams. Wimbledon
change that mentality. If they keep having good possession with the ball, getting the rhythm, knowing what they have to do and when to do it, I think if Manchester United is not on their day, it will be very difficult for them as well. So I think it's going to be interesting game.
It's great that you picked out Edinson Cavani. He just seems to be getting better and better with age. What's he like off the pitch? Is he a leader? Is he a really good influence on the younger players, do you think, at Manchester United?
Well, I think he will. He might be. It's difficult for me to know from far away. I don't know the language. I know he doesn't speak much English, so that's sometimes it's a barrier, between them and the other players. But I think sometimes you don't need to speak as well. You need to work as he always does. It's a player that he's very professional. He likes to compete. He wants to be the best. So with that characteristic that he has, I think it's more than enough for the young players to see how things you need to do if you want to be a good player. So I think it was a good player for them to bring to the club, and of course now he's scoring goals. He's more adept, and it's giving them too much happiness,
And finally, Diego, obviously Manchester United, they want to be in the Champions League. Back when you were playing for them, that they're always competing Champions League for the title. This would be Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's first trophy. Do you think this could be the start of something? Do you think getting this one trophy could lead on to others?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course. Sometimes it's difficult when you have too much history and you won so many things many years ago, and then since Sir Alex Ferguson left, everything was unstable. Not unstable, but it was not like steady like it was before when he was on the club. It was a big figure that left. He was everything for the club. The club was everything for him as well. So that transition is difficult to fill that gap, and it was a big gap to fill. Now Ole is on the job. He's been there for a long time as well, and he's doing quite well. Of course, the money that the club is spending on players is not the same as it was before. But I think if you want to build something, I think winning the UEFA Europa League, it's a good start, and also for him that he's a young coach and he's doing really well.
That is Diego Forlán, who won the Europa League with Atletico Madrid and played for both of today's Europa League finalists, Manchester United and Villarreal.
Fantastic to hear from Diego Forlán again, John. When I heard that you were due to be speaking to him, I went online and watched a 4-minute video of some of the best goals from his career. He was a cracking striker, wasn't he, back in the day? Switching to the managers then, John, it'll be Villarreal boss Unai Emery's 4th Europa League final, as we say. Whilst in the opposite dugout, Manchester United boss Ole Gunnar Solskjaer will be managing in his first major final as a manager. He's been speaking to the BBC's Steve Crossman. Remember, Solskjaer scored the winning goal for Alex Ferguson's United in the 1999 Champions League final, exactly 22 years ago today. And now the Norwegian is just moments away from leading his team out in a European final as their manager.
I've always dreamt big. And I was naive enough to have in my contract with Molde, if Man United came and asked, I was allowed to go. So that was always a dream of mine. And I've been one of these, played football manager and championship manager over the years. And of course, I've always been Man United. So it's going to be a very, very emotional moment, of course. But it'll only be a good one if we manage to bring the trophy back.
Do you know what the emotions will be yet? Or do you think you might not know until you sort of step out?
No, I think it'll be the same as when I was a player, because you do your job and you focus on your roles and responsibilities, and you don't think about the consequences. You don't think about what kind of game it is. Sir Alex always used to say, play the game, not the occasion.
Were you any good at Championship Manager?
Very, yeah, very. You know, when you're a footballer, you've got so much time, you're on the road, you travel, and I spent a lot of time on it, and now my kids are playing it.
You were 2 years into your managerial career when you coached in your first major cup final. That went pretty well.
Yeah, that was a very, very nice, special occasion as well. We beat Rosenborg, Ullevål. That's always the biggest game in Norwegian football. And to be able to lift the trophy was fantastic. And then there was hopefully a little taste of what's to come. Great build up to the final, how you prepare, how you relax the players like they are ready. Because you work with players at a different level, but it's still human beings. You still have to help them control their emotions.
There's a massive difference between a Norwegian Cup final and a Europa League final, clearly. But did you learn anything from that experience that you can kind of reflect on and use?
Yeah, I think so. But as I just said as well, players at a different level, but it's the biggest game in Norwegian football. This is the second biggest game in European football, because it's not the Champions League, but it's a Europa League final. So you just still have to prepare the players mentally. We're all human beings. We've got there together as a team. Don't suddenly change what you've done to get there, and don't build the game up more than you have to.
You said it was a dream and that you're a dreamer. Can you remember the first time you would have dreamt of coaching Manchester United in a major final?
Oh, probably when I was injured, when I was around about 30, when I felt maybe I won't be able to play again. And I thought maybe this life has been taken away from me. Then I started thinking about the coaching.
What would be the perfect Europa League final?
As long as I see my players go out there confident, performing, expressing themselves, the spirit in the camp is so good. So I want to see them with chest out, Man United badge on the chest, head forward, confident.
That's Ole Gunnar Solskjaer with the BBC's Steve Crossman there, speaking to Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Our football reporter John Bennett is still with me. John, he sounds very relaxed, doesn't he, ahead of the big kickoff? But could this evening be a defining moment in Solskjaer's managerial career, do you think?
It could be, because the United hierarchy, they stuck with him, didn't they, through some tough times, and they're beginning to be rewarded. They've had a good season. They finished second in the Premier League, but they need a trophy. This is their longest run without a trophy since the 1980s. So Ole Gunnar Solskjaer has to start winning silverware. He's got close before, lost in many semi-finals. For example, the Europa League semi-final last season. Now is the time to deliver, because they are huge favourites. It's a massive night for him personally, and for Norway as well. His country, Solskjaer could become the first Norwegian manager to win a major European trophy.
Come on then, John. Less than quarter of an hour to go till kickoff. Let's get a prediction from you. You mentioned United, heavy favourites. Can you see them slipping up at all? Will Villarreal cause a shock?
On paper, it has to be a United victory. You can't see anything other than a United victory. You've talked about Edinson Cavani. He's in fantastic form. Villarreal do have their own forward in great form. Gerard Moreno, 6 goals en route to the final. For the first time in his career as well, he hit over 20 goals in La Liga. He's in Spain's Euros squad, so United have to keep him quiet. But yeah, everything points to a United victory. And if they don't win, then the media tomorrow will be really interesting, because there's massive expectation on Manchester United in this game.
All right, let's just wrap up a couple of other bits of football news from across Europe, John, because we've had some breaking news within the last hour or so, with Inter Milan, the newly crowned Serie A champions of Italy, of course, announcing that manager Antonio Conte will be departing the San Siro. Is this a surprise?
It's not really. His future has been uncertain for a few months now, only for off-pitch reasons. On the pitch, Antonio Conte's Inter, they've been superb. They've dominated Serie A this year, won the title with a 12-point lead over AC Milan in second. But the majority owners of the club, Suning Holdings Group, are suffering financial pressures at the moment. There are financial issues at the club. It's likely to mean cost-cutting, so wage cuts potentially, and player sales as well. I think that could be a big problem. And also the fact that they won't be able to spend money on big transfer fees. So I think those plans of the owners clearly don't match up with Antonio Conte's ambitions for the team next season. So he's gone. And interestingly, now he's one of the favourites to take over at Real Madrid if their current coach Zinedine Zidane decides to leave. A huge amount of speculation about his future. Inter said in a statement in the last couple of hours that Conte will forever remain a part of the club's history. But he's gone after 2 very successful years.
You wonder if Tottenham Hotspur might have their interest pricked as well with their vacant position as well. Finally, John, a word on the European Super League, the story that never goes away. Inter Milan, of course, were one of the founding members of that club. They quickly came out and renounced the Super League, but the three teams who have yet to do so, yet to even pull out of the breakaway competition, Real Madrid, Barcelona and Juventus, have said that they won't bow down to pressure from UEFA today to end their attempts at launching the new breakaway competition. I mean, this just isn't going to go away, is it, John?
It's not. The three clubs have released a joint statement. Basically, it's a reaction to Tuesday's news that UEFA had opened disciplinary proceedings against them. UEFA, you may have heard on yesterday's programme, said proceedings have been opened against the three for a potential violation of UEFA's legal framework. So this is Real Madrid, Juventus and Barcelona. Today, they have all responded. They say the opening of disciplinary proceedings by UEFA is incomprehensible and is a direct attack against the rule of law, while constituting a lack of respect towards the authority of the courts of justice themselves. That line, Mike, is a reference to the fact that a Madrid court has asked the European Court of Justice to establish if FIFA and UEFA are breaching EU competition law by preventing clubs from creating this breakaway European Super League. The statement goes on to say, instead of exploring ways of modernising football through open dialogue, UEFA expects us to withdraw the ongoing court proceedings that question their monopoly over European football. So this saga, Mike, is not going away. The European Super League talk and discussion goes on.
Yeah, strongly worded stuff. As you say, John, we have not heard the last of that. For now, though, John Bennett, many thanks.
Live on the BBC World Service, this is Sport Today with Mike Williams.
Finally on today's programme, the impact of climate change will likely lead to impaired performances at this year's Tokyo Olympics. That's according to a report backed by leading athletes. In the report, titled Rings of Fire, it's argued that summer heat waves in Tokyo during the past 3 years indicate that conditions will be tough. Concerns over heat have already caused the marathons and race walks to be moved from Tokyo. Professor Mike Tipton from the University of Portsmouth helped produce the report.
Most people think in terms of ambient temperature, and they understand things like it's 30 degrees, it's 30. Degrees. However, once ambient temperature gets above your mean skin temperature, so once it gets into the 30s, then your primary route of heat loss is by the evaporation of sweat. And to do that, you need to have a relatively dry environment to do that efficiently. So, of course, the other problem comes where you add high humidity to a high temperature. And, of course, what happens then, instead of evaporating and cooling the skin, the water just drops off you, and producing sweat does nothing for you. It's the evaporation of sweat on the surface of the body that is the important part.
I mean, how worried, concerned are you that athletes will really suffer, and we could see athletes being carried off the track or taken away from the rowing course, etc., with heat exhaustion?
I would be fairly confident to say that performances will be impaired across a lot of sports. And I think that's one of the things that people should bear in mind. As we deal with warmer climates and as we have the increased likelihood of heat waves, then the sport as a spectacle will be impacted, both in terms of the performance level of the people doing it, as well as the officials, as well as the spectators, the risks to them. And I hope we won't see heat stroke. But one of the problems you have with elite athletes is they have an ability just to keep pushing themselves, which is one of the reasons why they're elite athletes. Whereas you or I might feel, well, I'm too hot, I'm going to stop. They don't. And that's why we see so many athletes getting into trouble in sports events. These guys will push themselves to the point where they'll collapse. And the likelihood of that happening
is much higher in the kind of conditions we're talking about in Tokyo.
That's Professor Mike Tipton, who was speaking there to our sports news correspondent Alex Capstick, and Alex joins us now. Here we were thinking, Alex, that coronavirus was going to be the biggest challenge for games organisers in Tokyo. This extreme heat, though, is a real concern, isn't it? What are some of the report's recommendations?
Well, this report, Mike, was produced by the British Association of Sustainability in Sport, and they've gathered information from leading scientists, as you've been hearing, and from athletes competing in the type of endurance sports that will be affected by extreme heat. Sports such as the triathlon, where there have been multiple incidents in the past of athletes suffering from hot weather. It talks about the danger zone in rowing, the impact on tennis, the marathon, equestrian, where, of course, it's the horses who are in danger of falling ill. And the study does make a series of recommendations to help mitigate the risks. Rescheduling events for earlier or later in the day is one of them. Rehydration and clothing innovations, the introduction of extended cooling breaks, and providing more shaded areas for athletes at competition venues. They even suggest relocating the host city should be considered if the climate is just too hostile, or even moving the games to a different time of the year, which has happened with next year's Football World Cup in Qatar. That tournament, people will know, will now be played in the winter months.
Yeah, well, let's hear now from the former British marathon runner, Mara Yamauchi, who has lived, worked and trained in Japan. She saw the effects of extreme heat on athletes when commentating on the World Championship marathons in Doha in 2019. Those races were held at midnight, but many athletes, she says, were still clearly in distress.
So I commentated in Doha on the marathons and the race walks, and the women's marathon was on the very first evening. I remember feeling in Doha that this is the hottest place I've ever been to, even hotter than Tokyo. And we were down on the Corniche before midnight preparing, and then, of course, during the race. And, well, there was some discussion before the women's marathon about was it safe to go ahead, and the organisers decided that it was safe to go ahead, but 41% of the field did not finish, which is obviously a huge proportion. And we could all see on our screens the impact of the heat. I believe it was the slowest winning time ever, 2:32:43 for the women's marathon. So I think this may be an example of how summer championship marathons go in the future. They'll be slow, tactical. Some athletes may choose not to take part. There might be a high dropout rate. And that really changes the event in terms of the race.
Well, Alex Capstick is still with me. Alex, Professor Tipton alluded to it, and Mara Yamauchi there as well, said extreme heat can mean that the quality of performances, and therefore, I guess, the overall quality of a championships can be severely affected by this extreme heat. The decision to move the marathons and the race walks as far north as possible was taken in early 2020, wasn't it, by the IOC and IPC? Do you think organisers will look at this report out today and make further changes to this year's Olympics and Paralympics?
Well, that decision to move the marathon and walking events to cooler Sapporo was because organisers wanted to avoid the distressing scenes witnessed in Doha, whereas you've been hearing some of the athletes really did struggle. The road cycling events were placed on the slopes of Mount Fuji, where again temperatures are more manageable, and start times for some events have been shifted to earlier in the day, although the scientists aren't convinced that that will make much of a difference in Tokyo because of the size of the city and the density of the buildings. It means the heat is retained for 24 hours during the summer months. This warning hasn't come from nowhere. Until COVID, as you said earlier, the major concern for organisers had been the boiling temperatures in Tokyo. So I don't think we'll see any other late changes. But the authors of the report are keen to stress this isn't just about Tokyo. They say that as the world warms up because of climate change, conditions could be just as bad, if not worse, in Paris and then in Los Angeles, which will host the next two Summer Olympics. And moving further into the future, the Games might not even be viable at all unless they take place in winter.
Meanwhile, Alex, briefly, amongst all this, there have been further calls for the Games to be cancelled today altogether, not because of temperatures, but, of course, because of the pandemic.
Yes, and this latest one has come from one of Japan's most popular newspapers, Asahi Shimbun, which, like many other newspapers, is a local sponsor of the Olympics. So its demand for a cancellation is being seen as significant. It's the first national publication to come out against the Olympics. In its editorial, the paper said, "We can't think it's rational to host the Olympics in this city this summer."
And the level of opposition in Japan does seem to be growing. According to opinion polls, as we've been hearing over the past weeks and months, around 80% of the population want it cancelled or a further delay. Local doctors are concerned, influential business leaders have voiced their disapproval, and there's been criticism of Thomas Bach, the IOC president, after he suggested that sacrifices would have to be made, although it wasn't clear what exactly those sacrifices were that he was referring to. But despite all of this opposition, still no sign that either the IOC or the local organisers are about to pull the plug.
That's the BBC's Alex Capstick. All this, of course, ties in with our week of special reports about how sustainability in sport and how climate change could threaten the future of several sports and major events. If you did miss any of that, then there's lots of content and great articles right now over on the BBC Sport website. We are just a couple of minutes away from kick-off in the Europa League final over in Gdansk. Manchester United against Villarreal. A reminder of the team news: Harry Maguire on the bench for Manchester United after his injury. David De Gea starts in goal ahead of Dean Henderson, whilst for Villarreal, Tottenham's on-loan defender Juan Foyth comes into the starting lineup in the one change to the side that lost to Real Madrid in the La Liga finale at the weekend. But that is it for this edition of Sport Today. From me, Mike Williams, many thanks for listening.
Sport Today is a BBC Sport production for the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where we're finding out what it takes to turn a dream into reality.
You have this mindset that's like, I'm going to figure it out, whatever it is.
And that's kind of how my whole life has been.
Join comedian Eliza Skinner, Paralympian Scout Bassett, and me, Ed Harry, as we find out what it takes to become an elite athlete. In the first episode, we talk to Matt Stutzman, the armless archer.
On the podium, today at 21:30 GMT. And in 30 minutes, Health Check with Claudia Hammond.
We'll be asking whether kindness can be contagious and looking at new evidence on the effectiveness of different vaccines against the COVID variant first identified in India.
Available 24 hours a day on smartphone and on smart speaker. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and after the news, I'll be back with Finders Keepers on the Compass. In this final episode, I hear how museums are changing.
We'll never say Columbus discovered anywhere. Discovery is not what Columbus did.
I find out how complicated getting things back can be.
The government passed an amendment to allow claims back to 1840. So all of a sudden, we now had a window to pursue our claims against the Crown.
And realise why what happens in museums really matters.
And if museums are to be a tool of social justice, then we have to be not perpetuating those same racial inequalities within ourselves as organisations, because we're storytellers on behalf of the nation.
Join me, Kemisa Causeway, for Finders Keepers on the Compass, right after the news.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Climate activists have won a groundbreaking ruling in a Dutch court against the oil giant Shell. The court ruled that the firm must cut greenhouse gas emissions by almost half by the end of the decade, compared with the level 2 years ago. Donald Pols from the campaign group Friends of the Earth described the verdict as historic.
For the first time in history, a judge has ruled that a major polluter must stop causing dangerous climate change. The judge left no doubt about it. Shell is responsible for causing dangerous climate change, and Shell has to stop doing that. This is an enormous victory.
The judgment is binding only in the Netherlands, but could lead to similar cases elsewhere. Shell says it's disappointed by the ruling and will appeal. It says it's investing billions of dollars in low-carbon energy. The UN says it is deeply alarmed by reports from Ethiopia's Tigray region that at least 200 people displaced by the fighting have been rounded up by soldiers and detained. Ethiopia's military has dismissed the allegations as fabricated. UN officials are warning of a serious risk of famine in Tigray after 6 months of conflict. From Addis Ababa, here's Kalkidan Yebeltal.
The arrests took place in the town of Shire late Monday night. Eyewitnesses told the BBC that soldiers entered the makeshift displacement camps in Tsahaye and Wenfito schools and arrested hundreds of residents, most of them men. A spokesperson for the Ethiopian army rejected the claims. Colonel Getnet Adane told the BBC there is no way our troops would do such a thing. Now, in its 6 months, the conflict in Tigray is showing no sign of slowing, and many humanitarian agencies fear the crisis will only get worse.
Dozens of people in northwest Nigeria are missing after a boat broke in two and sank. Most of the passengers were women and children. Witnesses say more than 160 people were on board. So far, about 20 have been rescued. The authorities in Kebbi State told the BBC that divers and emergency workers were trying to save others, but correspondents say it's unlikely that many more survivors will be found. Police in the US state of California say at least 8 people have been killed in a shooting at a rail yard. Others have been injured. The gunman, who is also dead, worked at the rail facility in the city of San Jose. Speaking to reporters, a police spokesman, Russell Davis, said investigations were underway.
We do have multiple agencies here helping us out. I will tell you about the suspect right now. The suspect is confirmed deceased. I will not go into details as what the cause of death is at this point. But the suspect is deceased at this point, so the public safety is safe at this point.
It's believed the attacker may have first set his own house on fire before going to an early morning union meeting. Police have not revealed whether the officers fired their weapons. Live from London, you're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. The British Prime Minister's former chief advisor says tens of thousands of people died needlessly from coronavirus because of disastrous failings by the government. In lacerating evidence to MPs, Dominic Cummings described Boris Johnson as unfit for the job. He said the UK had been too slow to go into lockdown because the Prime Minister initially dismissed COVID-19 as a scare story. Mr Johnson has rejected the accusations. There have been reports of more protests against unemployment in the northern city of Sohar in the Gulf state of Oman. Hundreds of protesters are said to have stopped traffic and clashed with the security forces. The demonstrations, which are rare in Oman, began 4 days ago. On Tuesday, there were reports of protests in other towns too. The government has attempted to respond to the demonstrators' demands, ordering the creation of more than 30,000 jobs. Amazon says it's agreed to buy the Hollywood studio MGM for nearly $8.5 billion. The deal would give Amazon's video streaming service access to 4,000 films, including the James Bond and Rocky franchises. It's the second most valuable agreement ever signed by the company. The Royal Navy in Britain has appointed its first female admiral since it was founded nearly 500 years ago. Jude Terry said she was honoured to be the first and predicted she wouldn't be the last. She'll take up the job next year. Jonathan Beale reports.
The promotion of Jude Terry to Rear Admiral marks another important milestone for women serving in the Royal Navy. She joined the Navy in 1997, just 7 years after they were first allowed to serve at sea on a warship. It wasn't until 2013 that the Navy lifted its ban on women on submarines. Commodore Terry, who's 42 and hails from Jersey, has spent much of her career at sea, in the Gulf, Far East and the Caribbean.
Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale reporting. And that's the latest BBC News.
I didn't know they were going to actually make me walk up to the top of this hill to do this. Seriously, guys? I'm Kemasa Causeway. You're listening to The Compass on BBC World Service, and this is Finders Keepers. I've been finding out how people around the world are fighting for museum objects to be returned to where they came from. I've learned about the scale of the problem and what some people are trying to do to resolve it. In this final episode, I want to get a sense of what the future might hold. Just driven over an hour from where I live in Newcastle, up in the northeast of England, and now I'm standing on top of a hill on Easby Moor in North Yorkshire. The village where the celebrated navigator Captain James Cook grew up is just at the bottom of this hill, and just in front of me is a stone monument to him. It's really tall. It's about 20 metres high. What does that say? A man of nautical knowledge, inferior to none, born at Marton, October 27th, 1728. It shall be deemed the honour of a Christian nation to spread civilization among pagan and savage tribes, the name of Captain Cook will stand out amongst the most celebrated of the human race. Later on, I'll be talking to some people in New Zealand whose ancestors ended up on the receiving end of